Hello, and welcome to one more chapter with me, Kay. I'm Alleena, and today we'll be reviewing The Thinking Woman's Guide to Real Magic. This is the book that I had talked about in my book haul last week and last video. This is the one that my friend pulled off the shelf and said it was like Hermione in the real world. I have a few choice things to say about it, so first we're going to start at the beginning. Follow a character named Nora, and she has a whole bunch of problems with her PhD and not being inspired and not knowing her real direction. She ends up in a graveyard by accident wandering around the mountaintop where the wedding shower was, and ends up reciting a spell on a gravestone thinking it was just poetry. She ends up wandering through an iron gate into a world of fairies and magic and wizards and magicians and all kinds of drama. And when she's finally there, there's no end to the drama. The fairies aren't as they seem. They're masked, they are chaotic, they are magical beings that are more about showing you what you want to see versus what's really there. It begins out with this sort of romance, and it's so Twilight-esque that at first I wasn't sure what I was reading. I am not a fan of Twilight because of the way that the relationship is portrayed. It's not very realistic. And so when we see Nora and this Phaetorin, which we'll get to that in a minute, the Phaetorin Racklin, it feels a very Edward and Bella-esque romance, kind of escalating way too quickly. And so I decided, alright, well, there's something to this. Every once in a while, Nora's consciousness would say, wake up, there's something wrong here, this isn't correct, this can't be real, this is too good to be true. But she would ignore it. She would ignore it, and it ended up getting her into a lot more trouble than possible. Find out that the Phaetorin are kind of intruders into this world, the same as she's an intruder into this world. Nora ends up married to this like demon, fairy, dragon dude that is not about actually having a wife, let's just say that. She ends up enchanted so that she thinks she's in love and she doesn't understand that she's enchanted. Ends up escaping into the care of the magician Arundiel. He saves her with a gust of wind and takes her away after she's almost dead by the hands of this dragon. I'm not going to spoil as to why she's so important to the Phaetorin because this is kind of a key part of the story. We actually follow her story for the most part in the care of the magician Arundiel. He has a natural aptitude for magic, and even though this character, this magician, is kind of older and crankier, he understands that there's some sort of aptitude that she has, even though the only goal is to get home, to be with her family. Some part of her changes, but I guess is what makes a really good novel, some part of her changes to understand that there's more than what meets the eye. She goes through all kinds of different transformations throughout the story. We meet a whole bunch of really important characters, but what I want you to take away from this review is that this is sort of like Pride and Prejudice meets fantasy world, and it's actually kind of amazing because at first I didn't pick it up, even though the Pride and Prejudice novel is really important, even though that Nora herself is an English major PhD. So there's this romance undertones, and there's this fitting into a new world sort of undertones, and I would say this is pretty decently done. I wouldn't say this is the best book on the market. I think I'd give it like a 4 out of 5 stars, maybe 3.5. I said before, the relationship that Nora had with Racklin was a little rocky, but I read through it because I wanted to see her story. By the end of the book, characters that were at war were so well developed that I couldn't help but just love her and love their story and root for her, which I suppose means it's a well done novel. Now, let's talk about some of the stuff that wasn't so great. We're going to go back to the Racklin and Nora thing. That was absolutely unacceptable behavior, but of course we find out later that it was a bad idea. Find out later that, of course, she didn't mean to be in this relationship, to be enchanted, to be tricked that way. She had just wandered into the care of the Phaetorin queen, Alyssa, and everything went downhill from there. And we're also going to mention the fact that there's a lot of the times in the novel that it gets a little slower. We're talking about how she's working in Arundiel's castle and not really progressing the novel very much. We have a lot of inner dialogue where she's writing letters to her friend who she hasn't seen because she's been in this other world. We find out in bits and pieces that the other world thinks that she's dead or kidnapped, that there's a crime scene where she disappeared into the other world. We find that the door is closed. We find out that the reason she can't pass through again is because people want to use her to open another door and to let the Phaeton escape into a different world. Another problem that I want to say is that I didn't feel like the novel really resolved itself in terms of the conflict with the Phaeton. Elisa and Racklin end up disappearing and we see nothing of them. The other Phaeton give up really easily after their queen is gone at the end of the war. I'm not going to tell you what actually sets off the war because that was actually a pretty cool thing. The way that Nora grew enough as a magician and as a person and a character to get to the place where she was part of the war is really important. I think you guys would really like that. Like I said, this book is kind of like Pride and Prejudice meets a fantasy world, and I think it's pretty well done considering. I feel like at the core of it, it is a love story. It's not really a coming-of-age tale. It's not really a magical tale. It's not really a tale of war and revenge. All those things are kind of woven into this love story between Nora and her work and her family and Arundia. The relationship between the two characters are a little strange, but I feel like Nora's a really likable, relatable character. She was really well written. I felt like this book could have gone so much further. A lot of the middle part could have been cut out in order to bring about a sequel, or to expand upon the ending, or to give the Phaeton just a little bit more oomph that needed to happen for them to be, a decent enemy. I'm not saying that they weren't, scary, because they were, but there was never really a face-to-face resolution of conflict between Elisa and Arundia and Elisa and Nora. It was all just kind of up in the air at the end, and everything was destitute and cold and grim, and it was just the queen ran away. The queen ran away so the rest of these evil beings, if they really were evil and not just following their own laws, they were just hanging out like, oh, we have no queen, we're going to govern ourselves. But I felt like it would have been much stronger if Nora and Elisa, Nora and Racklin especially, had been able to duke it out a little bit. We didn't see that at all. In fact, during large stretches of the book, there was times when there was no conflict at all except for between Nora and herself, which I guess is fine, really. But I was really looking for some sort of resolution in that. In fact, when she had gotten married to Racklin, I don't know if I spoiled that for you guys, I apologize, but when she had gotten married against her will to Racklin, this dragon, fairy, weird thing, she had a wedding ring, and it was sort of so magical that it was the only thing left when she was able to finally get back to her family. No one could take this off without her turning into some sort of crazy statue. I kid you not. That's a really cool part of the story. So, there was a little, sort of cliche sort of things that could have been worked out a little better. I would still give this book a 4. It's really good. I think it's worth the time, but I wouldn't put it at the top of your to-be read list right away. I think it was lacking a little bit of something that could make it a great book that people might option off for a movie, that people might be like, this is great, you need to be reading this book in public type thing. It's great. I wouldn't say it's bad, honestly. It's just not great. It's not up there. I've read other fantasy books that are just much more well done than this one, and although I really loved Nora, and I thought she was a really good character, it was lacking just a little bit of a something. I'm really glad that I did take the time to read it, because honestly, I've been procrastinating a giant anthropology paper, but it's okay. We'll get through this. We always get through this. And honestly, the book that I'm reading now, which I might do a to-be-read list for you guys again soon, the book that I'm reading now is actually really cool in regards to how this Pride and Prejudice sort of tie flows through this one and into the next book that I'm reading. I'm about 20 pages in. So yeah, overall, 4 out of 5 stars. It's a good book, honestly. But I wouldn't say that it's the best book in the world. If you were thinking about reading it, I would say borrow it from the library. It's worth the read, but not worth worrying whether you're going to read it or not. There's a couple of other books, more awesome books, like Mort, which I reviewed in a different video. I'll link to that below. I wouldn't say better, because each book has their own sort of way of being awesome, but definitely more intense, definitely more wow than this one. I would say read it if you were thinking about reading it, but don't freak out too much if you don't get to it. It's pretty contemporary, pretty classic sort of fantasy stuff. The magic and the world building and things not being quite the same as our world. It's not an urban fantasy, it's based in a medieval type world. So it's pretty classic. I think the only thing that's going to give you more of a different sort of feel is the whole Pride and Prejudice storyline. If you hadn't read that book, definitely check out the Spark Notes on Pride and Prejudice and then read this book, and then you'll get a better understanding for it. I would say if you are also an English major or somebody looking to be a PhD in something, there's that little cute sort of line throughout the entire thing. One of my favorite little tidbits is there was an ice demon that ate poetry. I kid you not. The ice demon ate poetry. He's in the back of the book, and I thought that was cute. I think give it a little bit of time, but like I said, don't freak out if you can't read it or if you have to buy it. Like, it's not one of those sort of books. I enjoyed it, but I would not say it is one of my favorites. That being said, I read through the last 100 pages without putting it down. The last part of the book is really good. I think that makes it worth it altogether. I think that's what gave it the 4 out of 5 as opposed to maybe a 3. So yeah, that's my review. I hope you like it, and I hope you got some information about this wonderful book. And I'll see you next week.